Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top Black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the Black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have the project you need help with? Look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your media, your way.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 6 of our course, Early History of the African Renaissance from 1896 to the present. We're going to cover a lot of information today, and most of it will cover the years between the late 1960s and up to the 1980s. Actually, we'll go up to around right at 1980, 1970, and then we will stop. A lot of information to cover today, and it's going to tie right into what we talked about last week. So last week we looked at the work actually we looked at two works. First, we looked at the Battle of Algiers, and then we looked at A Man of the People by Chinua Achebe, which talked about one, independence, particularly independence from settler colonies. And then the second piece talked about what independence immediately looked like in many African countries. Because remember, A Man of the People, the country was never identified. It was a composite country. It had aspects of Nigeria, aspects of Kenya, aspects of Ghana, so on and so forth. But essentially, what we saw in that book was the takeover of the independence movement and newly independent nations by certain African leaders that weren't concerned about the masses of the people. And then we also talked about what happened to those African leaders that were actually concerned about the masses of the people. The Patrice Lumumbas, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Sekou Touré's, Modibo Keïta's, so on and so forth, Julius Nyerere's. Some of them were able to survive the onslaught that came with Western imperialism, attempting to reassert itself through military coups and assassinations and things like that, and some succumbed. So we're going to talk about right now the end of the 1960s, and we're going to talk about how one work in particular, we're going to focus on one work today, really captured the mood of the African masses around the world in the late 1960s and 1970s. And that book that we'll get into today, click it, please, thank you, is The Groundings with My Brothers by Dr. Walter Rodney. We're going to talk about today who Walter Rodney was and what was the significance of this short book, which is a collection of lectures and speeches given by Dr. Walter Rodney in the 1960s and 70s. How did the groundings reflect the concept of Black power and Black consciousness in the 1970s? Now, I know my brother David H. is on the line. He's talking about this concept of Black. But this is the time period where Black power and Black consciousness becomes global. And it is a qualitative shift in how people are thinking about themselves. We're going to get into it. What does Black power mean? What did it mean by its advocates? How did it affect the Caribbean? How did it affect the US? And how did it even affect Africa? And we're going to talk about Black consciousness as well, which are two interconnected ideas, Black power and Black consciousness. And lastly, we will look at the Ethiopian Revolution and how it connects to the ideas of Black power, the ideas of Black consciousness and class struggle and class consciousness, and the African world described by Rodney and others during the time. So we're going to look at Walter Rodney. We're going to look at Haile Selassie. We're going to look at Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael today, all within the context of the African world in the late 1960s and 1970s. So Walter Rodney, born 1942, died in 1980. Before I get into who Walter Rodney was, I just want you to hear a little bit from Walter Rodney. So we don't have a lot of video footage available for Walter Rodney, but we have a few clips that are available on YouTube. And I already sent one to Daniel so that you can see Dr. Walter Rodney, who's a historian, talk about he's going to kind of give a review of what we talked about last week from his perspective. And this speech is from 1978, I believe. And I think it was at Howard University. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up.
I'd like to remind you that we'll be having the final lecture on the national question next week. Nelson Perry will be speaking Thursday, December 7th in Lock Hall Auditorium. Okay, and also
13 minutes.
And we see that there is another aspect, that one does not sit back and assume that this national independence per se, in and of itself, means that either the day-to-day social life of the African and Caribbean peoples has improved, or that they have assumed any greater control over their production, over their culture, over their future. This assumption would be false. We have to be, in a way, having accepted the validity and vitality of the revolutionary nationalist movement, we now have to become self-critical of that movement and to see its basic shortcomings. The movement produced African rulers. Someone was telling me not long ago about a rather crude, racist joke which is popular in Zambia. But in spite of its crudity, it makes a certain point. And what it does is it simulates a conversation between a white who is an engineer in Zambia, because the Zambians have a lot of white engineers, South Africans. So this South African Afrikaner white engineer in Zambia supposedly goes home to the Republic of South Africa and meets Vorster, the former prime minister, who was his boyhood friend. They hadn't seen each other for a long time, and he didn't know what Vorster was doing, so they were exchanging information. And he says, well, I'm an engineer, and Vorster says, well, since you went away, I became prime minister of South Africa. And he says, oh, where I come from, that's a black man's job. Now, a kind of crude racist joke, but if you know South Africa, you get the point. You know South Africa. So it's a black man's job nowadays, prime ministerships. We have a lot of black prime ministers. The Washington Post was describing what's his official position, the deputy prime minister of Guyana, as a large black man. So we have black men of all shapes and sizes who are prime ministers. And in a certain sense, that doesn't carry us very far. We want to see what substantial changes, if any, what movement is taking place within the African and Caribbean world today with respect to its location to the same international system into which we know that we have been located. And one has to be quite sobering in this, because looking at it realistically, there is not a lot to shout about. There is not a lot to celebrate. The role of Africa and the Caribbean in the international system has been becoming more and more marginalized, more and more peripheral. In fact, frankly regressive. There is nothing to shout about, nothing to celebrate.
Thank you, Dave.
We were integrated into the world.
So that's Walter Rodney in 1978 talking about what we talked about last week. Independence came. We had a number of black presidents and prime ministers in Africa and the Caribbean, but not a lot has changed for the African masses. And Walter Rodney, throughout his entire life, he only lived to be 38. We'll talk about his death. He only lived to be 38 years old, but he dedicated his life to the African working masses. Those people that get up every day, they work, they try to make the living, they try to do the best they can, and they don't exploit other people, whether they're in the Caribbean, whether they're in North America, whether they're in Africa. That's who Walter Rodney dedicated his life to. He's most well known for his probably greatest contribution to African history, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which was published in 1972. This book is a must own. If you want to understand why Africa is in the state that it is in today and how it got there, and the fact that this is not some just natural historical occurrence, this is the book to read. This book runs through slavery, it runs through colonialism. It's economic, it's political, and it's historical. And it talks about what actually happened that Europe was able to develop. America was able to develop. America's just an extension of Europe. Canada is just an extension of Europe, was able to develop so rapidly between the 16th century and the 20th century, and how Africa was underdeveloped. It's not an accident. If somebody comes into my house and they take my TV, they take all the appliances, they take all the cash in the house, and then they come back the next day and they say, hey, why are you poor? What kind of question is that? This book has the answer to that. This is how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and well-researched. He was a brilliant historian. So a little bit about his life. He was born in Guyana from parents that were incredibly active in political circles in Guyana. Now, Guyana was under the control of the British. We're talking about British Guyana, not French Guyana, in South America. He graduates from the University of West Indies Mona campus in 1961. So that's in Jamaica. 1961, he graduates. He then goes to school, gets his master's and his PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in 1966, a prestigious European institution. Here he learns how to combine political economy with history. He takes that study and he publishes his first published work is actually on his thesis, which was on the slave trade in Upper Guinea. And he looks at it from the perspective of the people in Upper Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, that area of West Africa. He then goes on to teach in Tanzania at the University of Dar es Salaam between 1966 and 1967. And the way he's teaching history is combining, again, economics, politics, a materialist analysis of history, meaning how do we look at history to see these patterns of economic relations and domination versus rebellion and all these different things from the aspect of African people. And he's in Tanzania, which is no coincidence. At the time, Tanzania, the prime minister is Julius Nyerere. Tanzania is one of the more progressive African countries where the leadership is actually attempting to do right by the masses of people. So all the development plans, all the economic plans, the political decisions are made with the best interest of the people in mind. That was what Julius Nyerere wanted to do. And Julius Nyerere, unlike many of his other contemporary African political leaders, voluntarily decided he wasn't going to run for another term and said that I'm going to serve my time and then someone else could take over. That set up a pretty good legacy in Tanzania. We didn't have a whole lot of military coup. I don't think Tanzania has ever had a military coup. Not a lot of political instability because of the example set by Julius Nyerere. And this trickled down to the university. This was one of the most radical universities in the world at the time, the University of Dar es Salaam. You had these radical scholars that were coming, reshaping African history, reshaping African philosophy, and using it to serve, again, the African working masses. So he's there for 2 years. He would go back to the University of Tanzania in 1969. But today's discussion is going to focus on what happened between 1967 and 1969. And that's when he goes back to his alma mater, the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. In 1968, he starts working there in January 1968. When he gets to Jamaica, he continues to work with the African masses. He gets to Jamaica, he has this very prestigious position teaching history at the university, and he goes out into Kingston. And when the book is called The Groundings with My Brothers, the reason why it's given that title is because groundings are these meetings, these informal gatherings of working class Jamaican folks, particularly Rastafarians and others. And we'll talk about what Rastafarianism is in a second. But you had these groups of people, working class people, youth, that might have been affiliated with gangs. You had people that, the government just kind of threw away, people that lived in the slums, people that came from the countryside and moved to the city and couldn't find work. And you had Rastafarians, and you had all these and radical youth leaders, and they would get together and have these groundings, these informal gatherings where they would talk about politics, and they would talk about history, and they would talk about economics. And Walter Rodney would join these meetings. And he wasn't joining to dominate the conversation like, oh, I got a PhD and I can tell you this and I can tell you. No, he listened most of the time. He listened to the Rastafarians talk about Babylon, which is what Jamaica and the West as a whole was called. Rastafarianism in a nutshell is it's a very complex spiritual system, but it emerges in the 1930s. The name Rastafarianism comes from Ras Tafari. Ras meaning prince, Tafari is a first name from Rastafari Makonnen, who become Haile Selassie. When Haile Selassie was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930, this was a sign to African people all over the world. This was, I keep making this connection because it fits so much. Ethiopia at the time was the real life Wakanda. Black people around the world loved Ethiopia, going back to 1896 when they beat the Italians and were the only African country not colonized. So when a king was crowned, an emperor was crowned in Ethiopia in 1930, Black people all over the world got to see the newsreel, because back then, you know, when things happened, it wasn't on TV, they would film it on film, and then that film would go all around the world. So Black people would go to movie theaters and they could see a real life Black king and queen being crowned. You know, people got all, you know, happy and stuff, or some people were, when that king got crowned in England a couple of weeks ago and they had a lot of stuff. Well, imagine Black people around the world who were being brutalized under colonization. This is the 1930s, and facing Jim Crow racism and segregation everywhere. And they get to see a Black king on screen, a real life Black king. So people loved Haile Selassie. And then it even increased because 5 years later, after he was crowned emperor, the Italians come back to Ethiopia and they invade Ethiopia. And then that just made Black people all over the world upset. It's like, this is our last place. This is our last bastion of freedom. And the Italians are coming back. Black people all over the world wanted to go fight to defend Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was ultimately able to get its freedom back from the Italian occupation. But during that entire process, a group of men in Jamaica decided that Haile Selassie's crowning of becoming emperor was a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So they looked at Haile Selassie as a divine figure, because if you know anything about the rulers of Ethiopia, they say that they were descendants of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, those biblical figures. And out of that union came the rulers of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie being in that line, in the line of Solomon, in the line of David. So he was connected to biblical figures. So the Rastafarians, as they emerged in Jamaica in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, they assigned to Haile Selassie these divine characteristics. We'll get back to that in a minute. But because of that, they rejected British colonialism. They rejected a neo-colonial independent Jamaican state. And they always rallied against that. Now, some Rastafarians actually went and moved to Ethiopia, repatriated to Ethiopia. Haile Selassie gave groups of Rastafarians land in Ethiopia to live. The ones that stayed in Jamaica and that went to other places like the US and to the UK, they had an adversarial relationship with the state. They said the state is Babylon. The state is evil. The state is trying to corrupt and exploit the Black man. And our only salvation is with this new religion that has Haile Selassie at its center. So Rodney would meet with the Rastafarians. He would meet with the people that were upset with what Jamaica had become since independence. So the authorities in Jamaica didn't like this. We'll get to that. So while he's meeting with, having these groundings with all these folks, he's under the watch of the special branch of the Jamaican police as well as the military. So it's almost like the Jamaican CIA or watching his. When he was in as a student in the mid-1960s, he was being watched by the British because of his activities were considered radical. The United States had a file on Walter Rodney, monitoring his activities because they saw him as a potential radical, a potential organizer, and a threat to their interests. So the US had a file on Walter Rodney, the British had a secret file on Walter Rodney, and the Jamaican government had a file on Walter Rodney. And now Jamaica is independent at this time. Remember, we have to say that because this is what he's talking about. We say we got all these Black prime ministers and Black leaders, but yet they're monitoring the activities of this black man and other radical black folks. So he gets to back, and he's doing all this work between January and October 1968, building with the brothers and sisters. He calls it grounding with my brothers, but there were sisters there as well, including his wife, who was pregnant at the time. And he's building with the working class people in Jamaica and the people in the slums and the youths and all that. This is during the same time that Bob Marley and Peter Tosh are also getting introduced to Rastafarianism, and they're creating a music that is going to span the entire world, this radical music, this radical reggae that is going to catch on all over the world and make Peter Tosh and Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer and the Wailers the first quote unquote first superstars from the third world. And all this is happening at the same time. October 1968, Walter Rodney gets an invitation to come to Canada. And he comes to Montreal. And he comes and he attends the Congress of Black Writers in 1968 in Montreal. Now, this is a very radical time in the African world, 1968. What has happened in 1968? April 1968, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. April 4th, 1968 in Tennessee. Around March 1968, either March or May 1968, four freedom fighters are hung in Zimbabwe, in what was then called Rhodesia, by the white Rhodesian government in 1968. There are riots all over the United States when Martin Luther King is killed. Student movements all over the world are in very radical moves. They're rebelling against governments. The anti-war movement is happening. So all this is very revolutionary times in the world. And what's on the lips of most of the Black youth and the Black students is this idea of Black power. So this is a Black Power conference. And at this conference, you have people like Stokely Carmichael, who's going to become Kwame Ture. You have people like Barbara Jones, who was a student in Montreal. And it was the Montreal West Indian community and the students at McGill that started this Congress and brought these Black Power figures together. And in fact, the Congress was dedicated to the lives of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. You see Malcolm X poster in one of the images there. So Walter Rodney is there, and he gives a speech called African History in the Service of the Black Liberation, because this is liberation times. That's what's on the minds of these young people. They say, we got independence, but the masses didn't get liberation. We got Black prime ministers, we got this, but the masses aren't free and they're not developing. So how can we get together and figure out what we're going to do? And the fact that they had this in Canada alarmed the Canadian government, because the Canadians are like, oh, what are you talking about? There's no racism in Canada. And the Black Power folks in Canada coming from Nova Scotia and Toronto and Montreal are like, nah, yes, there is. And we're going to expose it. And we're going to have this meeting. We're going to bring together the most radical thinkers in the African world right to Montreal. And they did that. And it was a very successful conference. So he gets there. And yeah, his speech was African History in the Service of Black Liberation, which we've talked about in past courses. We're going to talk about the man sitting next to him to his right soon. That's Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, another son of the Caribbean. So you got a brother from Guyana, you got a brother from Trinidad, and they're making these speeches in Montreal in Canada in October 1968. Well, October 5th, 1968, the conference is over. Walter Rodney's on his way back to Jamaica. His plane touches down in Kingston. The government of Jamaica does not allow him to leave the plane. They say, Walter Rodney, you are banned from Jamaica. This is a Black prime minister. This is prime minister is Shearer. Things like pronounce his name, Shearer. Tells, no, you can't come back to Jamaica. You're banned. Don't even get off the plane. The plane had to go back and take him to Canada. Meanwhile, his wife is pregnant in Jamaica. So he can't even get off the plane to see his wife, any of that. They banned Walter Rodney from re-entering Jamaica. The reason for the ban was this. The prime minister said, we think Walter Rodney, who is, again, he's a university historian. They said, because of his actions, we've been monitoring him, and we think Walter Rodney is planning some type of Cuban-style communist revolution in Jamaica. He's meeting with these so-called Rastafarians. He's meeting with these working class people. He's meeting with Claudius Henry, who was this radical pastor in Jamaica who had been accused of murder and different things, that served some jail time, but he had a following of people that were just upset with how they were being treated by the government. and their lack of opportunities. And there were a number of worker strikes in Jamaica. The bus drivers went on strikes, and other people went on strike. So it was a radical mood in Jamaica. And the prime minister said, Walter Rodney is somebody that's trying to stir up trouble in Jamaica. He's trying to start a violent revolution in Jamaica. Therefore, we're banning him. Not only we're banning him, we're banning books, we're banning anything that stinks of Black power. The book Black Power by Stokely Carmichael, banned. Any writings on Malcolm X, banned. Anything by Elijah Muhammad, banned. They banned all these books. And again, these are Black folks. This is a Black prime minister, not white folks. Jamaica's supposedly independent, but this is what they're doing. Walter Rodney couldn't come back to Jamaica. He ends up going home to Guyana, eventually goes back to Tanzania, but then he writes this book, The Groundings with My Brothers, talking about the situation. It's a number of lectures. So that's the first thing he talks about in the book, is the banning and what it meant. And he writes this at the beginning of chapter 6. The government of Jamaica, which is Garvey's homeland, and we talked about Marcus Garvey and the impact he had on the African world, has seen fit to ban me, a Guyanese, a Black man, and an African. Now, notice how he describes himself. He says, I'm Guyanese. I'm from Guyana. I'm a Black man, and I'm also an African. So he's being very deliberate about his identification. Black, and being a Black man is about Black conscience and Black power, but he's saying he's also an African. He's connecting himself with the rest of the African world. But this is not very surprising, because though the composition of that government, its prime minister, the head of state, several leading personalities, though that composition happens to be predominantly Black, as the brothers at home say, they are white-hearted. They are white-hearted. These men serve the interest of a foreign white capitalist system, and at home they uphold a social structure which ensures that the Black man resides at the bottom of the social ladder. He's economically oppressed, and culturally he has no opportunity to express himself. That is a situation from which we move. So he writes about this banning, and he says these leaders, like so many leaders in the African world, be they Black on the outside, are white-hearted because they serve not the interests of the masses, they serve the interests of white capital. So that's what he talks about. He talks about the banning. The rest of the book, he goes on and talks about Black power and its relevance. Again, this is a revolutionary time, 1968. Black power is on the lips of everyone. Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud is the #1 song among Black people around the world. This is James Brown's song, came out in 1968. Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And this is a qualitative change among Black people, because during slavery, during colonialism, Black was associated with everything negative. Black people didn't want to be called Black. If you called somebody Black before the mid-1960s, they'd be ready to fight you. They say, no, I'm a Negro, or I'm colored, or I'm this and that. Don't you ever call me Black. If you put Black in front of anything, that was the ultimate insult. You Black dog, you Black this, you Black so-and-so. When the Black Power movement came around, they said, no, Black is beautiful. Our lips, our hair, our noses, everything about us, the way we dance, the way we move, connecting back to African culture. This is beautiful. This is nothing to be ashamed of. I love being Black. Love your Black self. Dr. King, before he was assassinated in 1968, for most of his writing, you read anything and you hear any speeches from Dr. King, from the time he comes on the public scene, he's saying Negro. The Negro needs to do this. The Negro has to do this. We have to respect the rights of the Negro. Negro, Negro, Negro. By the time we get to 1968, Dr. King is now saying Black. He's saying, I'm Black and I'm beautiful, have Black pride. So it's a qualitative change. People are no longer, Black men used to conk their hair. They used to take potatoes and lye and mix it up, put it on the comb and put it in their hair so they could straighten their hair. Fried, dyed, laid to the side, all that. But no, with Black power, that's when the natural comes. You saw Walter Rodney's natural. You see people have the natural comes. We call it Afro. So all these things are elements of Black power and Black pride. So this is what's happened in 1968. So the book talks about what that means. And not only that, what Black power means in Africa and the Caribbean. Because for many people, they're like, okay, we can kind of understand what Black power means in the context of a United States or a Canada or a South Africa, where you have a white government in control of Black people. Yeah, those people should have Black power, but you know, in Africa or in the Caribbean, everybody's Black. So why do we need to talk about Black power? Well, Rodney had an answer for that. Because he says, on this occasion, on the topic of this occasion is no longer just Black power, but Black power in you. Black power can be seen as a movement and an ideology springing from the reality of oppression of Black peoples by whites within the international world as a whole. Now we need to be specific in defining the West Indian scene and our own particular roles in this society. You and I have to decide whether we want to think Black or to remain as a dirty version of white. Black power in the West Indies means three closely related things. Number one, the break with imperialism, which is historically white races. So these are all the countries that seek to dominate Black resources and Black labor on the international scale. That's imperialism. Number two, the assumption of power by the Black masses in the islands. So not the Black folks that seek to exploit other Black folks, but the Black working masses. And number three, the cultural reconstruction of the society in the image of the Blacks. So Black power is just as relevant in Africa and in the Caribbean as it is in the United States, because what it's saying is we want our leaders to think Black and think and act and move in the interest of the Black masses. It's not enough to just have physically Black people in these positions of power. If they think white and they're white-hearted and they're pro-imperialist and they're pro-American and French and German and Belgian and all these companies coming in to exploit resources, they're not serving the masses. So we still need Black power in Africa, in the Caribbean. He said Black power is not racially intolerant. He wanted to make that clear, because a lot of people think, well, if you say Black power, that means you want to hurt white people, you want to attack white people, you don't have anything. He said, no, Black power is not about that. We're not racially intolerant. It is the hope of the Black man that he should have power over his own destiny. This is not incompatible with a multiracial society where each individual counts equally. Because the moment that power is equally distributed among several ethnic groups, then the very relevance of making the distinction between groups will be lost. What we must object to is the current image of a multiracial society living in harmony. That is a myth designed to justify the exploitation suffered by the Blackest of our population at the hands of the lighter skinned groups. So he's saying he wants true multiracialism, not what we have now, which is a myth of multiracial harmony. Because that's what the first thing people put up. So you talking about Black power, we're trying to all live together as one. Yeah, that's great, but you have to give up some power for that to happen. And this is what Rodney is telling us in this section. This is all connected to this concept of Black consciousness. So at the same time, Rodney is articulating this in Jamaica and in Guyana and in Tanzania as he's moving around the world. It's also being articulated in South Africa by Steve Biko. We talked about Steve Biko last year. Steve Biko, Bantu Steve Biko was a revolutionary. He was a writer. He was a student organizer in South Africa during the height of apartheid. And he came up with the concept, the articulation of the concept of Black consciousness. Black consciousness, the realization by the Black man of the need to rally together with his brothers around the cause of their oppression, the Blackness of their skin. He said, that's the reason why you're oppressed. Let's get right to it. In South Africa, you are oppressed because your skin is Black and because you're African and has resources and labor that can be exploited. And to operate as a group in order to rid themselves of the shackles that bind them to perpetual servitude. It seeks to demonstrate the lie that Black is an aberration from the normal, which is white. It is the manifestation of a new realization that by seeking to run away from themselves and to emulate the white man, Blacks are insulting the intelligence of whoever created them Black. It's very key. Stop trying to be what you are not. Embrace the beauty that is Blackness. Embrace the culture that is African culture. This is what's going to liberate us, not trying to imitate Europeans. So this is what's going on all over the continent, that we're seeing this, and it's rising because you have so many liberation movements that are occurring at the time. And this is just, I wanted to show you who Bantu Steve Biko was. And I won't read that entire quote. It's moving in Brazil, the country with the most Black people outside of Nigeria. They're having their own Black consciousness movement. A lot of it was sparked by the killing in 1978 by Robson Silva de Luz. Just like a lot of things happened in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. When the police killed this brother, the Black Brazilian population was remobilized. And at the time, Brazil was under a military regime, and the Black people got together in the face of military repression. And they say, we're Black and we're proud, because Brazil was just like everywhere else. Blacks were at the lowest of the low in terms of economic outcomes, social outcomes, all of this. So, and no one in Brazil wanted to be Black because Black was associated with poor and illiteracy and all these negative things. So Brazil had its own Black consciousness movement. The unified movement against racial discrimination turned into the National Black Movement, the Unified Black Movement, excuse me. They established National Black Consciousness Day on November 20th, 1979, or 1978, where they decided that we don't want the Brazilian government, which try to give us a day. They said, we'll make the Emancipation Day, Black People's Day, when we emancipated, we ended slavery in Brazil. The Black Brazilians say, no, we don't want that. We want our own day that we decide. And it'll be the day honoring our great freedom fighter, Zumbi. So this Black consciousness is spreading from South Africa to Brazil. You got Brazilian activists like Leila Gonzalez and Beatriz Nascimento who are talking about quilombismo and Black consciousness and all this. It's spreading all over the world at this time. The other element that's brought up in the groundings. So he talks about the banning, he talks about Black power and Black consciousness. He also talks about class struggle in the Black world. This idea that we have these working classes of Black people that are being exploited and they're not going to be exploited forever. And that's eventually going to lead to this revolution that's going to make things more just. And he used himself as an example. He said, let us have a look at our present condition. Most of us who have studied at UWI are discernibly Black, and yet we are undeniably a part of the white imperialist system. A few are actively pro-imperialist. They have no confidence in anything that is not white. They talk nonsense about Black people being lazy, the same nonsense which is said about the Jamaican Black man after emancipation, although he went to Panama and performed the giant task of building the Panama Canal. The same nonsense which is said about the West Indian unemployed today, and yet they proceed to England to run the whole transport system. Most of us do not go to quite the same extremes in denigrating ourselves and our Black brothers, but we say nothing against the system. And that means that we are acquiescing in the exploitation of our brethren. One of the ways that the situation has persisted, especially in recent times, is that it has given a few individuals like you and I a vision of personal progress measured in terms of front lawns and of the latest model of a huge American car. This has recruited us into their ranks and deprived the Black masses of articulate leadership. That is why at the outset, I stressed that our choice was to remain as a part of the white system or to break with it. There's no other alternative. And when you talk about the white system, you talk about the white capitalist system. What he's saying in this, and he's talking to university students, and this goes on today in 2023. The goal of the university is to take young people, but in the case of Black folks and African students, Caribbean students, it's to take us away from our people. I teach at the university. I know what it's about, what's happening. The desire is we want to show you that you can use your talents to keep this system intact. So even if you're not saying out of your mouth that, you know what, Black people can't do but so much, Africa can't do but so much, I'm just going to join this system. You're not saying that, but by not challenging the system, you're upholding it. And the university says, look, we're going to get you you're going to do your work, we're going to get you a fancy job, get you a nice house, a big car, and don't worry about struggle, because you're not struggling. So don't worry about the masses of your people. You can drive this brand new electric car and go from place to place. Don't worry about where the coltan in that car came from and the people suffering in the Congo. Don't worry about the lithium in that car and where it came from, the people suffering in Bolivia. Don't worry about the bauxite in your house and the people suffering to breathe in Jamaica and in Guinea, where that bauxite is being mined. Don't worry about that, because guess what? You're better than those people. That's what's implicitly being taught. Now it takes a scholar like Walter Rodney and others to say, no, I might be in this position as a university professor, but I'm gonna teach you what's really going on and how you can make sure that you're not brought up in that. Because this is the problem that we have in the African world. It's a class struggle. We got people that have and that exploit, and a whole mass of people that don't have, that are trying to work, just trying to make a living. And then you got people in the middle that aren't actively exploiting, but they're not saying anything and doing anything about the masses of our people that are being exploited. This is the group that many of us belong to. We're in that middle. We're not actively exploiting anybody. We don't own any mines. We don't own any factories. Yet we don't say anything about the exploitation that goes on in these mines, that goes on in these factories, the rampant unemployment, the government repression. We're not doing anything. So this is who Rodney is talking about. And when that group decides that they're going to connect with the interests of that group, that masses of our people that are being exploited, then we have this change that needs to occur. So let me stop here. Actually, I'll go a little bit more, then I'll stop. So I mentioned at this Congress, one of the people that was articulating a lot of these same ideas of Walter Rodney was this man here, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. Stokely Carmichael, from Trinidad, he grew up in New York. Just like what Walter Rodney talked about, he went to university, a very bright student. He could have been one of those people that joined that middle class of Black folks that got the education, got a nice job, didn't care about the masses of Black people. He chose not to. When he was in university at Howard University, this is when the civil rights movement was happening. He decided, instead of pursuing this degree, which would have made him a university professor and he could have just lived life in a lap of luxury, he's going to go down south and fight for the civil rights of Black people in Mississippi in the 1960s, the most white-controlled terroristic state in the United States. He decided to go down there to help Black people register to vote, for Black people to get their civil and human rights. As a result of that, he was arrested, he was beaten, he was attacked, he was pepper sprayed, all of these things. He was arrested, probably, only person arrested more times than Stokely Carmichael may have been Martin Luther King Jr. in the South. He was arrested that many times fighting for Black people's rights. He put his life on the line. So many civil rights workers were killed in Mississippi in the 1960s, and he was down there organizing as a part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Through that organizing, he starts something in Alabama, because he moves from Mississippi to organizing in Alabama, called the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in 1964, who took as their symbol the Black Panther. So this is actually the first Black Panther Party in the United States in 1964 in Lowndes County, Alabama. So Stokely Carmichael is organizing. And although he starts his career as an advocate for nonviolence, because of all his experiences in Mississippi and Alabama and in the South, he starts to listen more to Malcolm X. And this idea of self-defense becomes crucial to who he is. And they're not willing to be nonviolent anymore. And although he's a close ally with Dr. King, in 1966, this is when Black Power reaches the international stage, because the youth were tired of getting beat. They're tired of getting pepper sprayed and hit with fire hoses and police dogs and not being able to do anything about it. So they told Dr. King that, Dr. King, look, we know the slogan for the civil rights movement has been freedom now, but we want a new slogan called Black Power. And Black Power means Black economic power, Black political power, Black social power, and we're going to bring out this new slogan. Dr. King was very wary about Black Power. He was like, I don't know what that means. It sounds very similar to white power. I'm not really for it. Let's stick to freedom now. And they couldn't agree on that. So there was a rally in Mississippi, Greenwood, Mississippi in 1966. And Stokely Carmichael had just gotten pepper sprayed again for the umpteenth time, just been arrested again. He gets out of jail, he gets on stage at the rally, and one of his comrades, Willie Ricks, and some others, they said, we need to bring out the slogan tonight. So the people in Greenwood are around and they're listening, and Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks go, what do we want? And they tell the people to say Black Power. And the people go, Black Power, Black Power, we want Black Power. And that was picked up in the news and it went all over the world. And this is kind of the beginnings of this Black Power movement. And Stokely Carmichael is considered the leader of the youth, because he's only, he's only 25 years old in 1966. He's 25 years old, and he's the leader of this newly emerging Black Power movement. Now, all of this really explodes 2 years later when Dr. King is killed, because Dr. King was the only person that was holding a lid on a lot of people, because a lot of people were still holding out hope that change could occur nonviolently. But when they killed Dr. King, all bets were off. How can you kill the guy that wasn't even going to do anything to you? He was talking about nonviolence. Why would you kill him? So Stokely Carmichael and the advocates for Black Power become more known on an international level. And he gives a number of speeches and he's organizing the African masses. And it's not just about Africans in America for Stokely Carmichael, because again, he's from Trinidad. It's about Africans all over the world. And he eventually is highlighted by the FBI as somebody that should be taken out. We got these, declassified FBI documents from the time, and the FBI is saying, we need to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Malcolm X may have been such a Messiah, but he's the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. Elijah Muhammad is less of a threat because of his age. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines, nonviolence. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way. This is what the FBI was saying. This came out in 1967. A year later, Dr. King would be killed, and they would continue to monitor and harass and do all these things against Stokely Carmichael. You want to read more about Stokely Carmichael's life, Ready for the Revolution, his autobiography, Stokely Speaks, number one of his readings. You'll see that he eventually changes his name to Kwame Ture. This happens when he goes to Africa. He travels to Africa in 1967. He meets Kwame Nkrumah, who had just been deposed as president of Ghana by the CIA and the reactionary forces inside of Ghana, the armed forces. He becomes the prime minister of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in 1968, and he's going back and forth between Africa and the US, but eventually he becomes a secretary of Kwame Nkrumah, who's in exile, well, not in exile, he's a co-president of Guinea, whole nother story. And he helps to organize what Nkrumah has in his mind, this organization called the All African People's Revolutionary Party, an organization that was going to be made up of Africans all over the world who were going to be fighting to create liberated zones, to take over the state and create states that actually served African people. So he would spend the rest of his life, Kwame Ture, organizing this political party, which was outlined in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. A political organization that would be active in every country that Africans were, organizing African people to create a United States of Africa that would serve the interests of African people. All right, let's stop there, because one of the things that we'll get into is what happens when these ideas become active in a place that was never colonized. What happens when these ideas of Black power and class struggle become active in Ethiopia, among Ethiopian students, where it's no white people to resist? We're going to talk about that after the break. Let me open it up to questions and comments. So Daniel, anything in the chat or any hands? David H's hands. I knew my brother David H. David H, go ahead.
Thank you kindly, sir. Let me get this question right. From what I'm understanding, all the movements were geared at, they understood that Europeans were setting the standard and setting the stage for pretty much the world. And they understood that this was not the direction they wanted to go. But did they have a functional replacement for if they were to overthrow or remove the European influence? Did they have a functional replacement that they would go to, that they would teach? Because from what I'm seeing or hearing, there was no real replacement. It was always just get rid of the European influence, but then do the same with less European flavor. Like,
Yeah.
Did I miss something?
Yes. So I didn't explain it. So in Tanzania, where Rodney had taught, they were practicing the African socialism as explained by Julius Nyerere and others in Tanzania. So throughout Africa at this time, you had certain leaders that were actually doing their best to look at non-European, non-capitalist ways of organizing economies and polities. One was in Tanzania, and Nkrumah was going along those lines in Ghana. And then one of the main features of Walter Rodney's book is that he was a historian looking at African history for those exact models of what the development should look like. So part of his project was not just looking at history for facts and figures and dates. He was trying to find models, economic and political models that could be used in the modern times. In fact, at the end of this book, there's a postscript by Muhammad Babu, I think, is it Babu? Yeah, A.M. Babu, who was basically the Minister of Development, Economic Development in Tanzania, who talks about those alternative models that, if used, would help, stimulate development and all those things that the masses actually wanted in Africa. So yeah, you had folks that were articulate, not enough though. You had Sekou Touré in Guinea, you had Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, you had Nyerere in Tanzania, who were trying to think about different models of development to move away from that. So yeah, you had those, but they weren't, they were constantly under attack, number one, by the West. And those ideas didn't get as much. And then you had the intellectuals at the time who were also responsible for disseminating these ideas. Many of them weren't like Walter Rodney and others. So these ideas stayed in universities, and university folks weren't going to these groundings and talking to the people about, hey, here's an alternative, or even allowing the people themselves to come up with their own alternatives. They were suppressed by, the bourgeois leaders who didn't want to hear about these alternatives. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So why is that not happening? Like, as that's happening today then? Like, these ideas are there and they're still being suppressed, which is why, that's why I'm asking you for the answer, not hearing about it on the news, because I haven't heard anything like this anywhere other than your class.
This is what Rodney was going to do. And let me go back. This is something I forgot to mention about Rodney. Well, two things. One is, I hope when I read Walter Rodney and I get to this part of the class, it makes me feel bad, because sometimes I'm like, man, I must not be teaching right because I haven't been banned yet. I'm like, what do I got to do to get banned? No, but that when he was banned, the masses in Jamaica uprose. It was called the Rodney Riots. It started with the students at UWI when they found out that they wouldn't let Rodney off the plane and that they were banning him from the country. The students uprose. And then the students were joined by the working masses who Rodney had been amongst, the Rastafarians, the working class people, the youth in the slums and in Kingston, and all these places where respectable people wouldn't go. He would be in the gullies and in these places and in the schools and the churches and all these areas where they would have these groundings. All of those people, and then other people who had never even met Rodney, who were just tired of being exploited, tired of the prices going up, and tired of employment going down, and all these things, they rose up. And the Rodney riots were a huge turning point, even politically in Jamaica, because that government was soon replaced by another government. It was somebody at Jamaica could let me know. I think it was the PNP was replaced by somebody in Jamaica let me know. I think the Labour Party was replaced by the PNP. I think that's what I know. Manley comes in 72. But you have a change politically. So
the Labour Party replaced the PNP.
That's what
Yeah,
it
that
is.
is.
And had the first prime
No,
minister.
no. Shearer was JLP. So,
Yeah,
and
but
Manley was PNP.
Shearer was
So-
after Bustamante though.
Yeah, so you are right, Dr. Ledbetter. It's the PNP that replaced the JLP because Shearer was JLP and Manley PNP.
Thank you so much. So that's what we had, these riots. And it's funny how all this connects, because one of the main people in the riots was Peter Tosh. Peter Tosh commandeered a school bus and drove it through a department store with all these people on it, and then they took a whole bunch of stuff in the department store. And so there's a whole lot of stuff going on in Jamaica at the time. So, but the people rioted when these Rodney riots were important. I forgot to mention that when that happened. But yeah, this is what we're dealing with today. It's even worse today than it was, because at least back then in 1968, you had a social milieu where Black power and these ideas were even on the lips of young people in high schools, and they were having these debates in colleges and universities. You don't have a lot of that now. They've made it universities so expensive that people are afraid to speak out for anything. Really, that's revolutionary. You get, some Black Lives Matter stuff and different things like that, but people are so concerned of how do I get the job so I can pay off these student loans that you don't have the same level of student activism that you had in the 60s. And then you also don't have a professorate, academics who are also paying off student loans like myself. I mean, I'm not one of these academics, but they're paying off student loans. They're trying to get these things. So they're not having these groundings. What we're doing right now is type of groundings, because this class is open to everybody. Anybody that's on Montreal Road right now can come up here and come into this room. I wish I was doing this outside so that people walking past me, maybe that's what we'll do next year. Maybe we'll have these outside so that anybody can listen to it. But that's the whole point, is to get this information out to all of our people so that we can actually make this change and do the things that we talked about. So that's where we're at with that. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ledbetter, and as always, a beautiful lecture today. I have a couple of observations and a question. Hugh Scherer, who was the Prime Minister of Jamaica that banned Walter Rodney, he had a brother in Toronto who was a very good friend of mine. His name was George Scherer. I wish I had this information from today's lecture, so George and I could have had a good discussion. And George has passed away. And many of the academics from the Caribbean who went abroad to study, one of the common denominators they had upon completion was to return home with a white wife. And my question here is this. Stokely Carmichael, if my memory serves me right, was married to Miriam Makeba at one time after Hugh Masekela. Oh, I'm wondering, where did they meet? Because Miriam was exiled from a homeland in South Africa. So where did they meet? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I don't know if it was in the States. I think in 1968, she was with him at the Congress of Black Writers in Montreal. I believe she was there. I'm not sure exactly where they met. Yeah, I'm not sure. I got to look that up. I think it was in the States though. But it's really interesting the toll that the CIA and the FBI took on that relationship as well, on a lot of people's relationships. And these folks that were speaking out and were organizing Black people, they were constantly being surveyed and attacked in different ways by the FBI, the CIA, and these other forces, international forces as well, which took a toll on that relationship. But yeah, they were kind of an it couple for a while of Black folks that were committed to struggle and had an era of celebrity. Yeah, but I'm not sure where they met. Daniel, is there anything in the chat before I go to the second half of this?
No, there's nothing in the chat.
Okay.
I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
With all this, and I've seen the mention of Black power and the definition of it. How is it they're not able, the whole continent, how is it they're not able to come together and fight against Europe and the problems of the It seems like multiple examples of power to fight out the other.
The issue is two parts. One is education, is spreading the message to the people that actually need to hear it. We got to do a better job at that. Too many of our education systems, even back home, are still very Eurocentric. Even though it's not white people, it's still, you learn more about Europe than you learn about your own African heritage. The second part is we got too many of our leaders want to hold on to their little bit of power versus to have everybody come together. So they would rather be president of a place like the Gambia than, a senator in the United States of Africa or something like that. So that's the dual struggle, is we need to reshape our understanding of what leadership is. And I'm going to talk more about that actually next week when we talk about Thomas Sankara and how he's remembered or not remembered versus how Mandela is remembered. And having things like that, if we knew who Sankara was and his type of leadership, we would look at our leaders different. And then that would allow us to ask these questions about, okay, well, why aren't we united? How do we get united? How do we do these types of things? Because it's not just a unification in terms of in relation to Europe and America, because that's one thing, but it's also unification because these economists and political leaders, they've looked at the situation and they said, we need larger areas. Even regionally, we just need larger areas. So we have more internal markets. So we don't have all these borders where you got to pay taxes to go over this place. And Africa is starting to get toward that because we got this new free African trade zone, which is supposed to put an end to a lot of that. But more work needs to be done, more conscious building, more classes like this. And this question was asked by one of the young people who you all will hear from next week. And this is part of the project. This is part of what we're doing is we're getting this history into the minds of the young people, because I can't do this forever. We've been doing this for 5 years. I'm gonna continue doing this class as long as I can, but I don't want to be like one of our African leaders that's not preparing for the future. So that's why there's young people here that are learning how to teach, are learning this history so that they can spread it and keep spreading it. So that's what we're doing. So thank you for that question. Thank you for that question. I'm actually going to go back to the continent right now. So while all this is going on, there's a group of students that are studying in the United States, that are studying in Europe, and they're reflecting back on their own country, a country that wasn't colonized, a country that, again, was this shining example, which was Ethiopia. And their leader, by the time we get to the 1970s, Emperor Haile Selassie has been the leader since 1930, so 40 years of the same regime. A regime that was built as an empire. Remember, he's the emperor of Ethiopia. Empires are usually not voluntary organizations. The Ethiopian empire, as we know it in the 1970s, was built about a century earlier in the 1880s, 1890s, where you have three successive emperors. You have Emperor Tewodros in the 1860s, Emperor Johannes, and then Emperor Menelik II, the one that beat the Italians. And we applaud Emperor Menelik and Empress Taitu for defending Ethiopia against the Italians. But what we failed to look internally at is what was going on in Ethiopia. Ethiopia was an empire, meaning the emperor was conquering people and bringing them into the Ethiopian kingdom. Those conquered people were hyper exploited. As the empire expanded south into the land of the Oromo and the Afar and the Sidamo and the Somalis, as the empire expanded, those people's lands were taken over. And they were incorporated forcefully into this empire that everybody else celebrated externally because people didn't know what was going on inside of Ethiopia. So during his regime, Haile Selassie sought to modernize Ethiopia. He made these attempts. He wanted to, continue the centralization of the government. So he wanted to make this empire a true government and a true nation state. He wanted to replace the autonomy of local officials, local government officials, to solidify his control centrally over the Ethiopian empire. And he created a new government bureaucracy that was based off of skill and not necessarily, nepotism. So he tried to do that. The land during his time was still under a feudal system, meaning you had the emperor at the top, and then you actually had people that were royalty and governors that were beneath the emperor that controlled huge amounts of land. And they exploited the people that worked on those people didn't own the land, they worked on the land. This is a feudal system where you have a king, you have nobles, you have governors, and then you have the masses and military officials, and then you have the masses of people that don't own the land that they work on, that don't control the resources that they produce. At the end of the growing season, the landlord is coming to take a portion of those goods. In addition, the Ethiopian church is also in tandem with the emperor. The church takes its cut of what you produce. So at the end of the year, you have very little to show from all your work. And plus you don't own the land that you work on. And this was even worse in the South, the southern parts of the country that had been brought into the empire in the late 19th century. So the masses of Ethiopians, 90% of Ethiopians were under control of this system, and they were hyper exploited, the poorest of the poor. And then on top of all of that, as we know, that region of Africa has periodic famines, periodic droughts, I should say. And I want to be very clear about this distinction. This is important to point out. A drought is a natural phenomenon. It happens all over the world, different areas of the world. California has been in drought-like conditions for a long time. A drought is when rainfall is not sufficient for the amount of crops you're trying to grow and things you're trying to do. That's natural, it happens. Famine is man-made and caused by the actions of governments and men. There's been drought-like conditions in California, but there hasn't been a famine in California. People aren't starving in California because Californians can easily get food from Nebraska and Ohio and Iowa and these places. In Ethiopia, you had droughts in regions of the country, but not everybody was starving. The rich people were living incredibly well and fat and doing all this. It's the poor people that were starving and suffering because of how government allocates resources and how they allowed the wealthy to exploit the underclass and the working class. Famines are man-made catastrophes. You can manage a drought if you plan accordingly, if you save grain, if you equitably distribute food, if you work with other countries to get the food in and do these things. You can avoid famine, particularly in modern times. There's no reason there should be famines in the 20th century. There's no reason there should be famines. Droughts, unavoidable. Famines, very much avoidable. So all this was happening. But at the same time, while Selassie is trying to modernize the country, he realizes that he doesn't have enough people for his government bureaucracy to actually run the government. So a lot of these poor people now start to end up going to school. The university is opened up and Selassie is educating these people. And when these people get education, they're getting angry because they're seeing the inequality very starkly. In 1960, it was a failed military coup to overthrow Haile Selassie. The military decided that enough is enough, and they tried to overthrow him. It didn't work. Two of the leaders of this coup were, right before they were executed, one of the two brothers kind of orchestrated this coup. They said, "Woe to you and your master. One dreads to think of the calamity that awaits you when the people of Ethiopia fully understand my intentions and rise against you in unison." This is the last thing that one of the brothers said before he was executed, because this coup was done by some senior military officials, some intellectuals, and others. And they attempted to overthrow Selassie and put his son in charge, but the son really wasn't for it. They were trying to force the son to be the new leader, but the coup was, it wasn't successful. But this was just the first instance of the unrest in Ethiopia in 1960. So throughout the 60s, things kind of continued as they were. The emperor was at the top of the social regime, people in the middle getting fat off the wealth and the exploited labor of 90% of the population. So a number of things happened. One, the groups that made up the revolution included the urban and rural working class, leftist student groups, and the military itself was starting to become unhappy with the regime. The urban and royal proletariats were vehemently opposed to the policies of the imperial government. So you got this working class, you got teachers, you got taxi drivers, you got all these people that are workers in Ethiopia that feel like the government isn't responding to their needs. And then the people in the rural areas, the ones that are being hyper exploited, of course, they're not happy. You got these unions that were radicalized, you got these students that were ready for change, and the revolution had the union membership, the Confederation of Ethiopian Labor Unions, had 150,000 members. So unions were incredibly active at this time. The students were the most radical group in the country. These were students, again, a lot of them were poor. They had come from the rural areas, they had come from the poor sections of the urban areas. They're learning about Black power. They're learning about all the anti-colonial movements that are happening in Africa. And even the Ethiopian students that are studying abroad, that are studying in the United States, that are studying in Europe, they formed the Ethiopian Students Organization. And they're starting to think about, wait a minute, it's really messed up where we come from. Our people are being hyper exploited. So they started to organize things like conferences that talked about land to the tiller. We should give the land to the people that actually work the land and not the people that are exploiting them. So you had two major questions that arose in Ethiopia among the student organizations. One was the land question. Everybody agreed, if you're poor and you work the land, you should own the land. You shouldn't be exploited. The second question, not everybody agreed upon. Now, this is very important because this affects Ethiopia today. Because Ethiopia was an empire that was recently built, that was built in the late 1800s, you had the national question. Some people said, we don't really want to be a part of Ethiopia. We want our area to be independent. We want the Somali part of Ethiopia to be a part of a greater Somaliland. We want the Oromo controlled part of Ethiopia to be its own country. We want to separate. We want Eritrea to be its own country. We don't want to be a part of this empire anymore. But then you had some students say, look, let's not separate. Let's just form one Ethiopia. We'll get rid of the emperor, but we'll form one Ethiopia where everybody's rights are respected. So both sides kind of had their points, their good points and their bad points. On the one hand, yeah, people should have the right to choose whether they become part of a unified government because it was an empire. They were brought in by force. So yeah, they should be able to choose. But on the other hand, the students that were saying, but if we create a situation where everybody is taken care of, why would you want to separate? And it would be better if we stay together because we'll be a stronger country. So they both have their good points. So the students are engaging in this discussion intellectually. But back on the ground in Ethiopia, though, a number of things happened that would spark off a revolution where the people, the masses would finally say, enough is enough, we're revolting. 1973, you have another famine, a famine in the Wello and Tigray regions. And Tigray was in the news, the past 2 years because this is where the latest war in Ethiopia was fought in Tigray mostly. There was a famine in these regions. Famine creates unrest. When people are hungry, Bob Marley and them say, a hungry man is an angry man. The people are angry, they're hungry. In January 1974, the army, there's mutinies in the army. The army the soldiers in the army who aren't being paid well, feel like they're being exploited, they rebel against their senior officers. Then there's a teacher strike. Then there's a taxi driver strike. Then the prime minister resigns. And then in order to try to save everything, they do a bunch of constitutional amendments that try to weaken the power of the monarchy and do different things, but that doesn't work. And then 100,000 Muslims rally for religious equality. A lot of people think Ethiopia is a completely Christian country. It's not. You have a lot of Muslims that were saying, hey, we're being underappreciated and exploited in the regime. So then the Muslims rally. By the time we get to June 1974, junior officers in the military create something called the Derg, or the committee. And these junior officers are like, we see what's going on in the rest of the continent of Africa, where you have these military coups. Maybe it's time for the military to take over. September 1974, the emperor is overthrown. The junior officers in the military take over the country. And at first they're aligned with the students. And these students still can't get over this land question and what they're going to do. Ultimately, the Derg takes over. The Derg does some revolutionary things at first, including the 1975 Land Proclamation, probably the most radical thing that they do, where they create a law that the people that work on the land will actually own the land. Probably the most significant land reform in African history, because this changed centuries of relations in Ethiopia, where the poor people actually controlled their land. It's the first time that this happened. This is a revolution. the peasants control over their own affairs by providing the creation for peasants associations and with broad powers over land distribution and rural development. So this was a great move. In this land reform, it's the most enduring effect of the Ethiopian revolution, like I said. However, the revolutionary moves made by the Derg didn't last long, because what you had these officials, particularly led by Mengistu, who decided that, you know what, I'd rather just have all the power myself. And the Derg did things. They neutralized the students. It neutralized intellectuals, and the Derg basically replaced the emperor as the repressive regime as we get into the later parts of the 1970s. But this was, and this is Mengistu here, as the 1970s progressed, the Derg proved unable to effectively deal with the problems it helped to create. It attacked the leftist groups, the intellectuals. A lot of people left the country, and the Derg essentially, they just replaced the emperor, and they tried to suppress the land question themselves, which would lead to another civil war and issues that still aren't resolved in Ethiopia today. However, the Ethiopian revolution is an example of what happens when you push the masses to the point that they see no other remedy other than revolution. And that's the truest expression of Black power. When the Black masses, whether they're fighting against Black leadership or white leadership, but when the masses decide that enough is enough and they're ready to change things, they'll do it. The question is, like was asked when we watched the Battle of Algiers, what happens afterwards? How do you create a situation where the interests of the masses are maintained after the change in power? Because what we had in Ethiopia is the masses were again neutralized, but this time by the military. So these are unanswered questions, but history gives us a lot to think about. History gives us a lot to assess so that we don't make these same mistakes again. So we're going to stop there for today, because this takes us up to the 1980s. And what we're going to get into next week, we're going to look at, again, two pieces of literature. We will look at Part of My Heart Went With Me, with him, the memoir by Winnie Mandela concerning Nelson Mandela's incarceration and her political activism. We'll read that. And we will also look at the memoir of Benedita da Silva, activist, Black woman activist from Brazil. We're gonna look at how African women who are representations of the African working masses in the 80s and in the 90s dealt with the neoliberal order, dealt with the changes that would occur after apartheid ended in the 1990s. And we'll talk about leadership and African women's role in that. So that's what we'll look at next week. We have 2 more sessions left. Next week, you will also hear from the youth about the African History Project that they're working on. So you'll hear from 3 youth next week, and we'll take it from there. So thank you all for listening. We will resume again next week. I want everyone to keep the 24th open. If you can come here in person on the 24th, if you're able, please do, because we want to recognize those of you that have been with us through all of these seminars and courses, and we have some certificates we want to pass out and some different things we want to do. So if you can come here in person on the 24th, please do. As always, I want to thank you all. Stay safe, and we will talk soon. Before I close out, let me go to the hands and any community announcements that folks may have. So Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Yes, just a quick one, Doctor. What is the reason for the exploitation in Ethiopia, and who were the people being exploited there?
So you had 2 levels of exploitation. One, it was a monarchy. So this goes back thousands of years. This is not a modern occurrence. So you have these kings, and then you have these princes and regional rulers that all exploit the working masses, the poor people, the peasants. So these are royalty, and they're military officials. And in order to, one of the perks of being in those positions is that you were a landowner. So the emperor is at the top of the pyramid. Then you got the military generals and these princes that are all connected to the royal family, and they all have these large estates that people live on and work on. And these people, the majority of the population, They're the ones that grow the food and tend the animals and do all these things. And the surplus of their labor is taken as in the form of taxes by these princes and military officials and members of the royal family, so on and so forth. So they're being exploited, one, by them. They're also being exploited by the church, who's in cahoots with the royal family. Because it's the church that gives legitimacy to the rulers, because they're supposedly in the line of Solomon and all that biblical stuff. So the church is working hand in hand. So the church gets their cut as well. The church owns huge amounts of land. And in addition to that, the people have to pay tithes to the church. So you're paying taxes to the government and you're paying tithes to the church. So that's one, just the people in general being exploited. But then on top of that, you have the people that were forcibly brought into the empire. So at the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, after Menelik defeated the Italians, actually before Menelik defeated the Italians, and it continued afterwards, the Ethiopian empire is expanding south and eastward. So as it's expanding and taking over the lands of other people, the emperor and the military officials are handing out land to their supporters up north so that now you can control your own portion of land and your own people that you can exploit. So they bring those exploitative relations from the north down to the south and the southwest. The only difference is the people in the north are all being exploited by people within their ethnic group. So you got people in Showa being exploited by higher officials in Showa, or Amara people being exploited by other Amara people, or Tigray people being exploited by higher Tigray people. Situation in the south, it becomes, let's say, Oromo people or Sidamo people or Somali people being exploited by outsiders. And that's where that land question, the national question, starts to boil up, because as the empire expanded, those lands were given to military officials, so on and so forth, and they just continued those exploitative relationships. Once Ethiopia developed in the 20th century, then you would start to get some other exploitation as well in the urban areas with the urban working class. So as people moved from those rural areas to the cities like Addis Ababa and others, you had factories being built and different things, taxi drivers, all that, and those people were also being exploited as well. They weren't being paid well, and that just leads to unrest and the people wanting justice, economic justice, political representation, so on and so forth. So those were kind of the dynamics in Ethiopia that led to the revolution.
Okay, thank you. I was just looking to see whether or not the exploitation was along religious or ethnic lines.
So with that national expansion, it becomes ethnic. It's not based off of it. It's based off of just military takeover, but it takes on an ethnic dimension and also a religious one as well. Because as the empire grows south and east, the Somalis are mostly Muslim. A large portion of the Oromo are Muslim. So there is a religious aspect to it as well. This is why when the 100,000 Muslim folks demonstrated in '74, it was a big thing. So yeah, there's a religious aspect to it as well. Thank you for that. I think that's David H. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ledbetter. I'm gonna come back to that horse that I like beating a little bit, but maybe I'm with a new perspective or a different way of looking at it. You will be able to explain something that'll give me a paradigm shift. But my understanding is that the definition of the word Black and its negative connotation existed prior to the chattel slavery time period. Therefore, the negative connotations of that word existed before that whole segment took place. Therefore, the Europeans decided, we're going to give that label to this group of people, all these different cultures. Doesn't matter where they're from, what religions they practice, we're going to group them all together and give them this one label, because it's easier for us as a European to do this and strip them of whatever they have. At which point, after you go through all that battle and you go through all that time and your turmoil, the people themselves then decide, we're going to not go by a different label, but keep this label and try to redefine it. Sort of like the N-word in music.
Yeah.
Okay, but so you're gonna keep the label that was put on you by someone else, and we're gonna redefine it and try to make it a positive. Now, all the aspects of the movement are completely positive, and it makes sense. I get that part, and the mind shift that they're looking for, that makes complete sense to me, because it's not a complexion thing. It's really a mind thing. It's where's your mind is at. Are you, following what someone put on you, or are you going to develop your own? And I'm all on board for that. But why keep the label that someone else put on you? That I'm having trouble with that hurdle. I'm just.
No, you're and I guess that's the best way to look at it is it's steps, because again, people like Kwame Ture, they didn't stay with Black. Like even Rodney, that's why I showed that with Rodney. He said, I'm Guyanese, I'm a Black man and an African. So the progression was many of these activists were moving toward African as their signifier. So I guess the best way to look at it is these are steps in a process of re-identification. And even African might not be the final step. Because I had talked to brothers that are like, well,
everyone comes from Africa.
Everyone comes from Africa, and that, maybe we should, I know a brother, he liked to push the idea of Kush, so that as a signifier. So it might even be something else in the future, but that it's steps. All these things happen in steps. So what you're saying is correct, and it's a position that a lot of other folks came to as well. But they had to get the Black first before they could even get to thinking about something else. So it was a necessary step in a process of what some would call re-Africanization or that type of thing. So that staying in it, I think we're at a stage now where what you're saying could be considered. I think, but I always say that with all respect for these folks, like you mentioned, like what they were saying with the Black deserves our respect and admiration, and what they were, more importantly, not just what they were saying, but what they were doing. Because at the end of the day, that's really what it's about. What are we doing with the signifier? What are we doing with the identifier? No matter what it is, that is the ultimate assessment of its power and validity. Is what are we doing with it? Because there's plenty of people that have taken African moniker and have done horrible things, and even Black. We look at what Papa Doc did in Haiti with Noirism, and what Mobutu did in Congo when he changed the name to Zaire and was talking about re-Africanization, but it was all cosmetic. So it doesn't matter what the label is if you're going to use it to exploit the people. That's the ultimate assessor of what we do and our actions. So
and that's 100%. But by keeping the label in what you're doing, isn't that showing your subservience, or that you're still subordinate to the people who gave you the label?
I think you can make the argument. No disagreement with that. I think that it is something to move beyond. All I'm only saying is let's respect the generation that brought that up, because I don't know if we would even be to the point of having that conversation if they didn't make that qualitative leap.
Agreed.
That's what I'm saying.
Agreed, 100%.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I also want to follow up with that, with the at the time that they're doing all this, they didn't, they understood that people of all complexions were capable and equal in their ability. But now that we have scientific evidence that the race thing doesn't exist and is completely just something that we're keeping in place because it serves the purpose of keeping certain people down and other people uplifted. So now that we're aware of that, I mean, and that has like to really sink in, right? Because you're looking around, you're seeing everyone topically and superficially, they could be different, but we're all the same and coming from the same genetic makeup. So it was like that lady did with the blonde, blue eyes versus brown eyes experiment. Same thing. Like if you just say, well, all blue eyes are bad and all brown eyes are good, it's at the same level of what we're talking about now. But I don't think that's actually sunken into people. Like people are looking around, they're seeing people are looking different, therefore they must be different internally. And I don't know how to get past that part, because
And I think we will. I mean, I think the issue is it's hard to get past it when those power dynamics are still set up that way. Is you got to change the power dynamic before that sinks in the way that you're talking about sinking in, because we know that, but yet and still when we look, all of the power, economic, social, all that is in the hands of folks that are lighter. So it becomes a reality. So once you change that, then I think that people will be able to understand it. And again, the human brain is completely capable of understanding that, because this is relatively new for humanity for us to even be doing this. Humanity didn't do this prior to the past 600 years. You had 500 years. You had people that recognize difference. It's clear as the day. Like, oh yeah, that person's brown, that person's darker brown, that person's this, that person's that, and that'd be it. Just like with the eye thing. So we were that way in the past for most of our history. Like the vast majority of human history, that wasn't a thing. So we can get back to that. That's is definitely possible, but not until you change the power dynamic that is evident, that there is this group and people closest to this group have all the power, and then this group doesn't. And that is the struggle.
yeah, I see that.
And once that's overcome, then we can definitely, because like I said, that's most of our human experience. That's why history class is so important, because you see that we're doing stupid. Humanity has progressed so much in the past 500 years in terms of technological advancements, but we're still stupid apes, and we do stupid things. And the fact that those two things are happening at the same time is what's causing harm to ourselves and harm to our planet, is that we're stupid apes that have a knack for technological advancement, but our morality,
our focus is in the wrong place.
it's in the wrong place, and it's detrimental to the entire planet. And we haven't caught up to that. Our morality hasn't caught up to our, technological advancement, which is incredibly dangerous. But yeah, that's where we're at. But that's what I'm saying is it's a new thing that we've come up with to increase exploitation of each other, and it's something that can be overcome. I always the historical examples of the Vikings. The Vikings always give me hope. That was the most bloodthirsty and vicious and backward group in Europe, but they would just run in. Everybody was afraid of the Vikings, and they would come in, they would pillage and rape and do all these things. And and destroy civilizations and all this. But now, Norway, Sweden, Finland, they're the most peaceful and developed places on the planet in terms of human development. So if the Vikings could do that, we got hope. It's always point to the Vikings.
Okay. Okay.
We got hope. As a human civilization, there's always hope.
Well, we're a lot more powerful than we think.
That's it. Or it's going to get to a point where Earth is going to have enough of us, and the universe is going to have enough of us, and we're overdue for an asteroid collision and some other mass extinction. So there's that direction it could go to. Mother Earth is getting upset. That's why all these wildfires are happening, because we've done so much damage. Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Afternoon, all. As great as the dialogue was between you and David H. right now, I think one of the things the main thing that is missing is the financial hierarchy, and the sense that that is also streamlined against with color, because if you're black, you don't expect to have it, and you're divide of it, so on and so forth. So the economic structure is also incorporated in the color line.
Oh yeah, still, and that's the reality, and that's what we're dealing with so many places. I mean, even back home on the continent, look at South Africa, look at what is occurring. You got political independence, but economic control is still in the hands of a minority. And when we look at the world globally, we look at the makeup of the countries that have and the countries that don't, and how that was all, orchestrated during this, how Europe underdeveloped Africa and other places, we see that. So the economic aspect is key. And this is where the struggle still remains. So we got a lot of work to do, but I'm very optimistic, as you all can tell, about our ability to do it. And this is how it starts, having these groundings. I might change the name of these to groundings in honor of Dr. Walter Rodney. And the other thing I forgot to mention is when he would go to these groundings, the brothers, they wouldn't call him Dr. Rodney. They would be they would call him Brother Wally. And he writes about that. He's like, listen, I came here to learn just as much as I came to talk. And that's what I like to do when we have these sessions. Like, I know some things, but I learn from you all as well. And I look forward to the open dialogues that we have. So, as always, I love doing this. I love that you all could join me, and we'll keep it going. So we'll meet up again next week, everyone. So have a good weekend, stay safe, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much. I hope you don't get banned. It's coming if you keep it up.
All right, everyone.
Thank you.
Afternoon.